Welcome everyone. I'm Claire Heffernan. I'm the director of LIDC, and I'm really delighted to be chairing this webinar, India 2020, the state of food insecurity. Now we know India has had, despite the considerable economic gains in recent decades, it's got one of the highest levels of food insecurity, and it's rising. I think from 2014 to 2019, the number of food insecure households has increased by about 4%, and I think Purnima will take us through some of this. And of course, there's over 40 million stunted children in India, which is the interest from the Action Against Stunting Hub. So how this increase in food insecurity, COVID-19, will play out on these already nutritionally very vulnerable populations, we don't yet know. So there are many academics who are predicting a forthcoming hunger pandemic. And in this webinar, we are absolutely delighted to welcome Dr. Purnima Menon, who has offered to kind of help us go deeper into these challenges and unpack some of these issues and solutions to food insecurity in India. So welcome, Purnima. And just very briefly, I'll give a very brief bio. Purnima is a senior research fellow at IFPRI, the International Food Policy Research Institute. She's based in New Delhi, where she's the theme lead for South Asia nutrition programs across IFPRI's Poverty, Health, and Nutrition Division. So in her work in India, Purnima directs POSHAN, which is the Partnership and Opportunities to Strengthen and Harmonize Actions for Nutrition in India. And this really looks at increasing the evidence base. So she conducts implementation research on scaling up maternal and child nutrition interventions, and she does a lot of work evaluating large-scale behavioral change and communication programs. So she has extensive research work across the world, from India, Bangladesh, Ethiopia, Haiti, Vietnam, and Nepal. And she also has one of her very kind of deep interests is in effective research translation for the policy community. So I'm sure you can all, she's shared her publications on Google Scholar, so you can check those out. And she also has offered a Twitter handle, which I'm sure she'll be on her slides. So Purnima, we are absolutely delighted to welcome you to this webinar today. Thank you for joining.
Thank you. Thank you, Claire. Thank you so much. So I guess we have, is it an hour or 90 minutes?
Just about an hour.
It's about an hour. Okay,
right.
Great. So I think what we had discussed is that, I would offer a few framing remarks, and then the rest of it would be primarily a conversation. I know the title is Food Insecurity, but I also know that, this is the Action Against Stunting Research Hub. So I've actually tried to put some thoughts together that speak to the issue of stunting and linear growth and where we are, but also reflections in the context of crisis, COVID-19. So thank you, for the invitation. If it's all right, I will share my slides and we can walk through that. And maybe, Alessia, if you could give me a time check in about 15 minutes, would be great.
Sorry, how many?
15 would be good.
Sure, I will do.
Yeah? Okay, wonderful. Thank you. All right. So the way that I'm positioning my remarks, my framing remarks today is really to speak to the issue of reducing the impact of crises on India's progress on child nutrition. And, those are all deliberately chosen words because I do believe that despite the large numbers we see, there are also insights emerging on the progress on addressing child undernutrition or stunting, linear growth, whichever term we use to take it. And what we are most concerned about today, those of us who have been working on this for many, many, many years now, is that the crisis introduces the potential for backsliding. So everything that we're doing, we kind of want to position it in that lens. Let's see. So let me say a little bit about what we do at IFPRI, particularly in the context of our work on nutrition in India. So the way that I would characterize our work is that we focus on three buckets of work. We focus on sort of understanding, documenting, and storytelling around the challenge of malnutrition in India, and we do it for beyond stunting. So, you'll see a lot of work we do, which is stylistic descriptions and other kinds of analytic work on telling the story of who's affected by what forms of malnutrition, in what areas, what do the percentages look like, what do the numbers look like. We do another bucket of work which relates primarily to understanding the determinants. And here we do two kinds of work. So, we do a lot of work on what I would consider standard epidemiological regression-based, analytic work with multiple types of data sets, really looking at what are the factors that determine certain nutrition outcomes. So in our work, we've published extensively now on the drivers of both stunting, wasting, and linear growth. We've done work on the drivers of anemia. We've been doing some work now also looking at overweight, obesity, so on and so forth. And then we've done another body of work, which is around, what drives success. So what are the factors that drive change over time? And there we use a multitude of methods to analyze. This is where I'll talk about this a little bit later, some of our work on analyzing success cases. And then the third bucket of work we do in our portfolio of research in India is to understand who is reached by current solutions. So there are a range of policy solutions that relate to nutrition in India, and we need to understand who's reached by those solutions, what the coverage looks like, the quality, those types of things. And then we also do evaluation work, where the evaluation work is really related to what is the impact of new solutions or of new things to address challenges in the solution landscape. Now, so what we've been learning about child growth or stunting in particular, and I've just chosen one paper of ours to highlight this, but this is the findings we have on what sort of sets apart geographic areas in India. So these are really sort of population level analyses, and what we did was, as soon as the NFHS data came out, we used the district level aggregate estimates that were available at that time to visualize, and then to analyze and decompose the factors that really made a difference between areas that had a high burden of stunting and areas that had a low burden of stunting. And what we found there was that the differences really relate to a whole set of underlying factors, which would then need to be addressed if we want to create change and bring the high stunting districts closer to low stunting. And so it's really the factors related to gender, poverty, and of course the reach of interventions accounted for. We were able to explain about 70% difference, and notably about half of that difference, half of that related to women's well-being. And I don't just mean women's well-being at the time that they were mothers, but a range of things that reflected a set of investments in girls and women through the life course, achieved levels of education, age of marriage, and sort of maternal or women's nutrition in terms of their own body mass index and things like that. Now, none of these findings, what we found is not new. There's been a ton of work on understanding and explaining the determinants of stunting in particular, but also of wasting by groups, by Subramanian's group at Harvard, for example, by some research at Emory, and also across India. And we continue to hone back into a range of determinants, which really, in a sense, emphasizes the fact that multiple things affect the environment into which children are born and in which children grow. And therefore, we need to account for all of this in how we think about both the determinants, but also in how we think about solutions. Now, I mentioned earlier that there are stories of change, of positive change across India. And we believe, really quite strongly at this point, that learning from what's been happening within the country in the context of the existing sort of policy frameworks and administrative mechanisms is a very powerful way of creating learning within the country, because it is much harder to bring to one place a set of solutions from another country that has very different political, administrative, and programmatic landscape. It's much more powerful within the country for us to look at what's been happening here. So we have conducted, in collaboration with the Global Stories of Change program of work, as well as with the Exemplar Global Health program of work, which we've been advising, methodologically rigorous case studies of stunting decline. So we've done this now for 3 states, and Orissa and Chhattisgarh was published. The Gujarat work is being written up. We've also examined a previously successful, but what I would call a recent slowed down kind of environment, and that's the state of Tamil Nadu. Here again, across the board, our analyses highlight that factors that have led to improvement in these states include, a coming together of a range of actions. I should say at this point that most of our work has been on looking at stunting declines, and we know that there are things to be learned about successes in other spaces as well, and investment. So here's sort of a summary of what we've seen from our regression decomposition analysis. So we use a combination of regression decomposition analyses, policy analyses, and which include both document reviews and range of stakeholders to put sort of a whole story together. And in many cases, the policy analysis and stakeholder interview work has been a longer period of time than the 10-year period that we regression decomposition work. So what we found is that across the board, we were able to explain sort of different levels of the change over time. So in most states, we were able to explain about 70% of the change that happened over time. And in some states, we were able to explain in other states. What we did find was that the changes in stunting were most apparent among the older age group, but that we believe is expected, given that many of the things have cumulative effects. We did find that there was mixed change in infant and young child feeding and other more immediate determinants, but there has been a consistent improvement in underlying determinants across the states, albeit to variable degrees. What the regression decomposition tells us, and I apologize, it's obviously the need to kind of look at all of this together, but the health and nutrition interventions, which include interventions in pregnancy and early childhood, accounted for about 20% stunting. And I kind of look at that and I go, that's really cool, because in the Lancet series, they predicted that if you scale up interventions to 90% or whatever, that you can expect about 20% stunting decline. And it was kind of interesting that what we found in the decomposition analysis.
Hi Purnima, sorry, it's Alyssa here. The audio is a bit breaking up.
Okay, should I turn off video then? Let me do that. Maybe that will help.
Thank you.
I'll also try to go a little. All right. Okay, good. We also found that household improvements in household assets and poverty, etc., also contributed to change, as did middle characteristics. In terms of the evolution of policies and how they supported, these changes, so the changes in reach of intervention or the improvements in poverty, etc., we found a combination of both set of major national efforts, including the ICDS and National Rural Mission. And we found that states responded differently, but what was most apparent in the success cases that all the states that had achieved higher than national average efforts is that they had all added to national efforts, and that a key feature there was the nature and timing of those state-led innovations and add-ons. And then the other thing, of course, was that in all of these states, they also had a range of security, economic growth, and poverty-focused policy programs. what supported this kind of change was, having a vision to address some kind of an outcome, but that outcome actually differed across states. So in in Chhattisgarh and Orissa, the outcome that was salient was the reduction of infant mortality rate or maternal mortality rate, but the policy changes were also driven by a vision to address security and poverty. We found a range of different things that related to the implementation space, but I think what was most important in a sense was that in all of these cases, they had capable and stable bureaucrats who were able to sort of, take on programmatic actions, were given space and time to invest in supporting programs. There were a range of financing mechanisms available that ensured adequate, stable, and flexible availability of financing, and there were, implementation systems. A range of changes were made within implementation systems to address coverage, to close, harmonize catchment areas and boundaries of different workers, etc. And last but not least, that it did sort of take hold of society, and there were in all the states, there were different kinds of catalysts and champions, in different places. It wasn't just a straight path of one set of people, a range of people came together. Now, one of the very interesting findings from, for example, our work in Chhattisgarh was that, when you look at the what happened over time between the HAZ by age distributions, at the end of the day, I mean, stunting is binary indicators. Changes in distributions are really important to look at. And we looked at changes both in the overall distributions, but also in these Victoria curves. And what you find, it's quite fascinating that, in Chhattisgarh, for example, where earlier you had huge inequity over time between the wealthiest groups, the top fifth of the economic distribution and the bottom fifth, over time that, has kind of that gap closed. And so it really reflects some interesting changes in the equity distributions there as well. Now, engaging the policy community itself around stunting and what it means and what it will take to do it has been a very long journey. It has been a journey that some of us have been working on since 2007, 8, right around the time or just before the time that the series was coming out. And the way that I lay it out is that the journey had to sort of go through these 4 steps of recognizing that agreeing on the drivers and agreeing on the solutions, getting all of the policy instruments in place and making the investments, actually making those programs effective, and then, learning, monitoring, and recalibrating. And I think at this point of time in the 2020 timeframe, I would say in India, we're in between the act and learn kind of, set of things. But science is also ever evolving, and that poses both opportunities and challenges. And here's, just an example of what that evolution has looked like. So if I think back to the early days when we were working on this, there was a lot of problem denial around, stunting and linear growth retardation, whether the growth standards are appropriate for children, so forth. Then there was, a lot of dissonance around the drivers. Was it sanitation, gender gap? Isn't it really multifactorial? There was dissonance around what the solutions should look like. The policy instruments have remained sort of around a particular program, ICDS, and sort of a food and feeding bias. But there has been a little bit more of an evolution, there's somewhat newer solution space now, a lot more discussion of, around change, around more of a multi-sectoral around programming. But most actions still remain, tightly around what sort of the base nutrition program has been. And when you think about learning and sort of monitoring and recalibration, there will always remain, a range of different issues. Data are slow to come into the learning ecosystem So for example, it's going to take a while before the NF5 comes into it, not because it's necessarily tested, but because now, COVID has put a roadblock in the data collection. And then the other thing, of course, is that when you have entrenched old policy instruments, recalibration is a slow process. So it's been, for example, work of a few years now to even raise salient issues around the food supplement, the ICS, happened there. So I think, I reflect on ourselves as scientists and as researchers and feel like in a sense, it's a privilege to have been part of a long journey. And, I like to remember that more than I like to remember the frustrating parts of that journey. Now, where we are in terms of, we've recognized in India, there has been very strong recognition of the multisectorality of the problem and the need for a set of multisectoral solutions. And this idea of convergence has been, quite strongly part of the program rhetoric and the ways in which people have been thinking about programs.
Hi,
but
Purnima,
we still
sorry.
have, yeah.
It's Alicia here. It's your 5 minutes warning.
All right, great. I'm almost
Fine.
there. Yes, yeah. So where we are, programmatically right now is, I think, still needing a lot of clarity on what multi-sectoral programs will need to do. And so we've been trying to do research to also kind of help bring clarity to it, and saying that what we need to do is to really focus in on the 1,000-day household and think about the fact that if you agree that there are multiple determinants that relate to food, health, and care, that the programs we think about and that are available in the multi-sectoral sort of portfolio must all reach the household in the first 1,000 days and must do so for the entire 1,000-day period, right? So this is very much a work in progress. And last week at the conference, we sort of unveiled this idea of the circle of protection and convergence needing to create that. Now, just very quickly before we end, I want to talk about COVID-19. So some of the work that we've been doing around, sort of consolidating our thinking around COVID-19 and its impact, and it's really applicable to any of these crises, is that the disruptive impacts will be both direct and indirect, that they will operate through multiple pathways and will operate over the short, medium, and long term, and that they will also be different for different subpopulations. And we've sort of laid this out. This is some work that we're writing up right now to really emphasize the point that we need a data strategy and enough data to come through on the pathways over the short, medium, and long term, and for different subpopulations, that actually helps us understand how these different impacts are going to play through, whether it's lockdown and the economic slowdown and the impacts of that on wages and security things, or the changes to health and nutrition programs, mitigation and adaptation strategies that are happening to those programs, and what that's going to sort of trigger. So we are making, in a sense, a huge call for a strong data strategy and a coming together again of researchers with the community to interrogate and derive insights on what that data is saying. So for example, what we've seen so far, and some of this was presented in our conference last week, is that we recognize that the multiple pathways are going to be important. And there are early findings across studies that suggest that many of these pathways are already affected. There are already a few published papers on the impacts on food insecurity and diets. And we need more. So we need more of that from a wide range of populations and subpopulations across India. I think the other concern, is around this concept of if we build it, will they still come back? So programs are coming back online, health and nutrition programs in particular, but there needs to be more research with communities to understand their perspective, their engagement with services, what it will take for them to come back. There are insights that vulnerable families will become vulnerable, and so that, last week at the conference, someone had presented very elegant work on pre-COVID insights on migration and nutrition, especially of circular migration, And those are sort of very hard-hit populations in the context of COVID. And so there has to be a lot of thinking about what's going to happen to those kinds of subpopulations. And then this idea that service delivery is absolutely not going to be enough to put families back on the path to nutrition. The data that's emerging is really highlighting household level fragility, different kinds for different populations, and that's going to need a lot more thing, and then a lot more support on through social protection and integration and more. And as I mentioned, the idea that data is really important. We need robust and frequent data on these key pathways so that we can understand which pathways are being triggered, and then work with the policy community to say, okay, what are mitigation strategies? I think where we are in terms of just, again, this is from the conference last week. We had about 3 sessions on child growth, stunting and wasting, and I think the most important idea that we wanted to leave the policy community with was that whether you're looking at stunting or wasting, these are really sort of disruptions to the overall normal pattern distributions of growth in the first 2 years of life. And rather than focus on the binary cutoffs around the margins, we should be thinking much bigger and thinking around distribution patterns. And across the board, people are agreeing that prevention should be a primary focus. And in the context of COVID, we need to think very hard about the added support to these vulnerable 1,000-day families, because it's just going to be a range of different things that we anticipate that these families are going to buy. So I'll just close again, with this slide, because I think it helps us think about, what is it that we need to think about in the context of the crisis, but also more generally, about creating protective environments for children to, for fetal development and for child growth. And, what is it that it will take in the context of India? It sounds and feels daunting, but in fact, these are all programs and efforts that are in place. They haven't been placed in this way, and looked at carefully to say, okay, 27 million babies are born every year. Are you able to create a circle of protection for every single one? So let me start there, and then I think we can start the conversation. Thank you. I'll leave the slide up if that makes sense.
Okay, great. Purnima, that was fascinating. Thank you for taking us through that kind of journey. So I guess, I'll start the questions off and start the conversation, and then we can open it up to kind of the wider audience who's joined us today. So I guess I'll start off with, can you tell us a little bit about Poshan, because of the, that's something that's very near and dear to you that you've been working on, and I'm sure people would be really interested on, because this research came out of that context. Yeah.
Correct. Yeah. So Poshan is, it's the name we came up with for our evidence policy initiative. We began work on it in September 2011, and did a lot of background work, interviewing many different stakeholders, reviewing lots and lots of documents, and so it took a year or so to decide, what kinds of research we're going to do that would be meaningful and relevant in policy context, but also how we were going to engage with the broader research and policy community in India to connect the dots between research and policy. So, right today, if you say Poshan in India, it's all very confusing, because National Nutrition Mission is also called Poshan, and you have, sort of Poshan entities in private sector, in different districts, in different states, etc. But, so it's kind of funny and exciting. But, we've continued on that journey. Our goal and our role is really to bring the evidence together as best as we can. And, we take a very sort of, all evidence is important to inform policy, not just our evidence. It's important to inform policy. And that's why we invest a lot in convening people, sharing community research. Everybody does, not just we do. yeah, so, we're in the second phase of the initiative. It will wind down next year. We're hoping for continuation. We'll see.
Yeah, that's great. So now you mentioned the conference last week. Maybe you can take our webinar participants through that a little bit through last week's conference and where they can find information on that.
Sure, yeah, we can. I'll paste a chat note here as well. But the conference we hosted last week it's called Delivering for Nutrition, and it's a conference that's very focused on implementation research. So we weren't looking at necessarily at biological research or new research on microbiomes and child growth or sort of very new innovations, but we were really asking the question of, okay, when you have a national program that actually has 15 or 20 evidence-based efficacious interventions in that program mix, and it has a set of delivery platforms that whose goal and job is to deliver those efficacious interventions to the population. What is it that we can learn about the reach, quality, delivery of those interventions? What does that look like, and what are the things that affect that? So it was very much a conference focused on implementation research and on evidence to inform implementation priorities and implementation actions. We brought together both researchers and implementers. We had, government representation. We had partner representation, NGOs, many researchers. Yeah.
So in that stakeholder group, you've just given us a very wide stakeholder group. Who is the audience that really you feel, uptakes this, and who is more resistant? I mean, stakeholders aren't all the same. So in your experience, who are the change agents? And who are the blockers? I mean, I know I don't want to put you on the spot, but I mean, just broad terms in your experience.
I think that's a very good question, Claire, but the way that I would put it is that everyone can be either a change maker or a blocker, and I have seen tremendous change makers and huge appetite for evidence in the policymaker community, and have also seen other researchers that are huge roadblocks in the research community. So we're not a monolithic community of researchers by any stretch, and so where there is dissonance within the research community, all it takes is for one prominent researcher to say, no, that's all rubbish, and then it takes that much more effort. So one of the things we really feel that the research community needs to do is to resolve internal tensions, to agree on what we agree on and agree on what we disagree on, and where more science is needed, because then we can walk a little bit, walk further together. And I think the same is true with the program community as well. It's okay. I mean, we need to say to them, there are things that we understand, we don't understand, and here's what you can run with, but maybe you should be a little cautious, do some learning around. So we try to be mindful of that. And there's a lot of navigation, but I think there's also now a lot of trust. I mean, the nutritional community in India today, whether it's a policy community or a community, is in a different place in terms of standing together more and being in a more cohesive space than perhaps we were.
No, I absolutely agree with you. I think the research community, we have a lot to answer for on some of these issues, in terms of like not being open to what a solution space might look like. And the very nature of academia means that it's always criticism, fall back. Correct. Oh, can we possibly agree to this? So academia in nutrition research, I think you could, I can absolutely, hear what you're saying. We're not joined up enough into a solution space to move us forward sometimes when we can move forward. And it's not, so I think that's a really interesting point. I'm glad you raised it, because it's, I would say that certainly speaks to what we many of us kind of have feelings about or have seen ourselves. Yeah. So thank you for that. And thank you for taking us through the kind of the workshop, and I'm sure everybody's going to be interested in seeing that. So coming out of that, though, if you had to say, like, because you've given us an awful, a broad range of things and interventions and things that work, and it's fascinating. But if you had to pick three, now I'm going to put you in the hot seat. Three interventions, right? Three priority interventions in India, given this context. Take us through what you think that would be.
Yeah, I'm not going to say priority interventions. I'm going to talk about, I would say priority areas for programs.
Okay.
So, the first and foremost, I think, would be we have to hone in on the before women get pregnant period. Too much of what we have done over time has been trying to get babies to put on more weight or whatever else, and we keep finding that the roadblock is when women don't start pregnancies healthy or well nourished themselves, everything you do after that is challenging, right? And so I think really everything that addresses what's going on in the pre-pregnancy stage, and in a lot of that in India, it is around the social determinants. It's around, are women staying in school longer? It's around what's going on with marriages, things like that. And of course, that has, in poverty. And so, I would say that the other bucket of work that I think really needs to happen much more in India is around connecting, the existing health nutrition programs with social protection that reaches that same age window. There are many social protection programs in India, and we just haven't connected dots well enough to say, how do you bring those in? Because those are the things that create that sort of protection around families in very vulnerable times. And so we're almost in a situation here where you don't need new programs, but it's about connecting existing, interventions and existing programs that the government is already invested in and already spending money on, but making sure they reach effectively to these, through that period. So I don't believe in magic bullets. I'm not going to put three magic bullets out there. I think the magic bullet, if anything, is finding the solution to, the connectivity of and sort of 1,000-day family targeting. That would be a magic bullet for me.
Okay, thank you for that. And okay, great. We've got two raised hands in the audience. I think Jessica was the first. Jessica, do you want to unmute your mic and ask your question?
Hello, thank you, Claire, and thank you, Purnima, for your talk. It was really fascinating. So I'm working within Action Against Stunting on the cognition and education team. And I was wondering if in your studies or in the studies you reviewed, you had measures of children's language or cognitive or motor development, and whether you could see progresses with delivery interventions. I mean, what kind of interventions can promote that, basically? Wondering if you have any evidence on that.
Yeah, no, of course, there is a big literature on that, and, Harold Alderman and Maureen Black and all of them are the ones who work a lot on that. We did measure language and motor development in the context of our work in Alive and Thrive, which was looking at the impact of behavioral interventions. And, interestingly, we did see impacts on language development, in particular of programs to address and improve complementary feeding. There is a lot of other ongoing work, especially people who are working under the nurturing care framework, including, I think, there are a few newly completed trials in India as well to look at the impact on a range of different outcomes. So I don't have a straight up review of the literature, but I think the interventions are very much in the space of supporting families to deliver, those nurturing care interventions. So parent education, home visits to the families to work with them to teach development-oriented skills as well.
So when you talk about delivery interventions, are these interventions where you just deliver the food, or is it associated with also this kind of support to families, or is it?
Oh yeah, definitely not just food, but also, yes, absolutely, the support to families. Yes, yes, absolutely. Yeah, and same for the conference I mentioned as well. The food part of the programs is one part of it. The efficacious interventions, a range of them that ought to be in the so yeah.
Okay, great. We have another question from from Heather, actually. Sorry, Heather.
Hi, Purnima. Thank you for that really interesting presentation. And I was really interested on the emphasis on data collection being so important. And I just wondered if you could say a little bit about how you've had to adapt your data collection processes and monitoring efforts during the pandemic, and how you're planning for that going forward when things are still so uncertain.
Yeah, same as everyone else who's doing any research these days. I think it's a lot of remote data collection. So, we're working with a range of different partners on interviewing health and nutrition service providers to find out how they've been doing and what kinds of positive adaptations they have been making to program service delivery. And so we're doing that, telephonic interviews. And then, that seems to be what most people are doing that I'm aware of in India and Bangladesh and other places at this point in time. I think in some places, as we also learn more about, viral transmission and, what distances you need to keep and what protection you need to have in place, I think people are slowly starting to venture back to in-person interviews, but I don't know, so far I have not heard of any research partners. And, I would have to say that's one thing that worries me, because if you read the global projections, the projections are that we're likely to see first sort of an increase in wasting. And I think we don't really have a way right now to measure that. I believe people are testing. So I've heard that in Rohingya camps, for example, in Bangladesh, they are testing mother-led MUAC tapes, so where somebody within the household is doing the measurement rather than an external innovator. So I think innovations in anthropometric data collection, we are ready for that. We don't have them yet. I'm hearing about all these things on phone-based and camera-based data collection or self kind of measurements by parents. But yeah, I think our anthropometry is going to be really disruptive. The rest, we'll have to do very much shorter surveys and really deeply prioritize what data is collected when you do remote data collection. But where you need to do anything in terms of physical measurement, I think this is an issue. So we're unlikely to know, the impacts of wasting, for example, even without being able to.
We have another question from Antoinette. You can unmute and put your video on.
Hi, Claire. Do you want to ask your question?
And then there was another one from Claire Bork. Have we got the audience questions? Or
Yeah, I was asking Claire from the audience.
Hi. Hi, sorry, I didn't know how to raise my hand. Thank you so much for your talk, Purnima. It's really interesting to hear the perspectives. I'm a researcher. I work quite a lot in Zimbabwe and Zambia, and there's been some recent data coming out from that region about WASH. I was really interested to see your regional level data showing that WASH had a growth benefit. But in some of the recent randomized control trials at a household level, it doesn't seem to improve growth in that critical window. I wonder if you could comment on your experiences from that context.
Yeah, no, we've all been discussing that quite a lot, as you might imagine. So, I have discussed it a lot with the PIs of those trials as well. So I think that, the big difference here is that the WASH that was delivered in those clinical RCT isn't necessarily the wash that is, truly protective in, in the context of regression analyses and other such things, because in sort of the analyses of large scale data sets, what you're looking at is sort of improved, sort of full scale wash. So families that have, access to water, access to improved toilets. And I don't believe that, the more rudimentary wash interventions that are put in place in the trials really meet that definition of what you would consider to be improved wash. So that's one thing. And, the other is, because of whatever the nature of those interventions were, did they really resolve the wash challenges for the families? That's something that we don't fully know about. The interventions were delivered with high fidelity, but did they fully meet, and close off wash gaps? So I think, the word is the same. We say wash for the regression analysis and we say wash for the RCT intervention, but in fact, they're quite different. What is sort of the definition of wash in the context of the DHS surveys, etc., is different from the interventions. So that's one. And I think again the quest perhaps may have been looking for too much from an intervention that doesn't really close all the things that need to be closed. So I keep going back to this idea of the circle of protection, to say, okay, we know that actions in all these areas are important, but if you're only going to try and isolate the impact of, say, just the ICDS, just in the context of India, then that's not even asking the right question, because we still have gaps in so many of the other things that, that cause poor child growth. So how much can you hold accountable one potentially intervention? I hope that's helpful, Claire.
No, thanks so much. I think that the very much is towards something a bit more transformative, as you say, and creating it more. It's really interesting to hear your perspective, so thanks for that.
Do we have any more questions from the audience? Actually, I've got a question, Purnima. In your graph, I mean, you compared two states, or 4 states, right? 2 very wealthy states and 2 less wealthy states. So can you take us a bit through that dynamic? And then can you also take us a bit through the unknowns? Because in some states, you had quite a big category of the unknown. So can you just take us through a bit through that?
So you're right, Claire. I mean, they are very different states. But interestingly, both, Orissa and Chhattisgarh, even though they have, poor population, the states actually have fairly well-functioning economies that come from other sectors that, for example, industry and construction and mining and, other sort of kinds of, so they're not really very poor states in terms of their economy. They do have higher burdens of poor in the population compared to, say, Tamil Nadu or Gujarat. But they're states that, were, they're quite different in that sense. But they're also all states that had made progress economically in that 10-year period. None of them was not growing, or, they were in every single state, there were poverty declines, and for different sets of reasons. There was, for example, in Chhattisgarh, there was job growth, there were poverty alleviating programs, or at least safety net programs like the PDS actually worked very well in Chhattisgarh. I mean, what's interesting about all 3 states is that they do have, strong inequities. So, the beauty in a sense of the NFS4 data allowed us to not, for example, look at either Gujarat or Tamil Nadu's entire states, but when you unpack the picture by district, you realize that, oftentimes stories are told about states, but stories should really be told about much, about even sub-state entities in terms of social progress, especially. The unexplained part of these models, I mean, that's just what it is. And, most of these are run with the demographic surveys data sets. So we don't really have a lot of, you don't, for example, have very good data on diets. You don't have even very good data on, on household food security. So there are, if you look even at the conceptual framework of nutrition, there are definitely missing buckets there. Why the models for Tamil Nadu function better than the models for Chhattisgarh, I don't know. This is methodologically, I think for those of us doing some of the regression decomposition models, remains an area of
No, I mean, it's amazing. I mean, thank you. The other thing I was going to ask you about was the tribal communities. There's a lot of tribal communities in Gujarat. There's a lot of tribal communities in Orissa. Did you pick up big differences on this kind of hierarchy of exclusion that happens
well, so we are about to start work on a synthesis piece looking across different states. I'm going to write that question down for us to explore. Now, one of the things that was definitely there in all the work that happened in Orissa in the 10 years preceding the 2016 period, was a very strong sort of focus program on the 15 lagging districts in the country. So they had a very strong focus on it, but a very strong equity focus was there in their health and nutrition programming. And, we think that really paid off in terms of the average declines that you saw. I need to go look at the Gujarat case study a little more carefully around that, but I know that in Orissa there was a very strong focus on that, and it related very much to the tribal communities.
Okay, great. We have a question from Naomi, please.
Yes, hi Purnima, thanks so much for a fascinating presentation. My question sort of follows on a little bit from Claire's, because I was really interested also in the regression decomposition analysis. You talked a little bit about how policies had evolved over the time that you've been running the analysis. And you said that one of the key features of success was when states had done add-ons to national efforts, and that the nature and the timing of those state innovations were really critical. I just wondered, could you expand a little bit on the timing element? What did you mean by that? Is it that an innovation from state level is more effective once there's been sort of front loading in terms of national interest, or is it important to have state interest and innovation right at the start?
Yeah, so I think it's, let me put it this way. So in Orissa, for example, they had maybe started doing a few things, or, the national program comes in, and then literally alongside that, the state adds in, their pop-ups to that program, etc. Or in some cases, like in Orissa, for example, the national program, there was a national program of maternity benefits, cash benefits targeted to pregnant women, but it was only in a few districts. But in Orissa, they decided to take it statewide. And then the issue of the timing is, if you think about, for example, the NFHS 3, that came out in 2007. October 2007 was when the NFHS 3 was released. And then you could just, draw timelines of when the different state governments engaged with the results of that for their states, how long it took between, maybe denying the problem or ramping up quickly to form a state-specific strategy or to initiate a state-specific actions. And in some states, it took a while. So it took quite a few years before, say 3 years even before they sort of really were like, okay, we really have to tackle this. Because sometimes it just takes time, or you have people who, need more time to dig into the analyses, understand what's going on the ground. Sometimes you have bureaucratic changes. So there's just a lot of things that determine, okay, from when a state or any entity sees a data point to when they say, okay, we're going to have, a strategy in place and to do something about it. And if you were already doing some things before something, number or a survey comes out, you're more likely to be able to kind of, pick up and move. This is, I think we're going to see the same thing on COVID, for example. States that had, pre-existing capabilities where they could quickly, figure out how to ramp up and deliver. If you were already reaching 80 or 90% of your population, say, the food supplements of the ICDS, then keeping that going, even when the crisis hit, more likely than not, maybe you come back down to covering 60%, but you're going to be able to get back up to 80 or 90% fairly quickly because your base levels are already high. But if your base levels were 20 or 30% coverage of programs, then, in the context of crisis, it's just not going to be possible to very quickly get up to reaching 80%, 90% families, So that's the kind of thing where timeliness and where the state is makes a big difference. I mean, even in NFHS 3, Orissa and Chhattisgarh were already ahead, ahead of other states in terms of ICDS coverage and things like that.
Okay, great. I think we've got time for one final question. So I'm going to go back to Antoinette. Are you ready for your question, please?
Antoinette, you will need to unmute your mic and then we can hear you. I think it looks as though your mic is still on. Oh, your mic should be free now. Yes, if you'd like to go ahead and ask your question, please, Antoinette Salah. If not, I'm going to go ahead and do it for you. Antoinette had been asking what the next steps are for research.
Oh, big question.
That's a perfect one to end on, Antoinette. Thank you.
Like I said, the biggest concern at this point would be any kind of backsliding, because it's on a good trajectory in terms of, political will, in terms of having a set of interventions, having frontline workers that can deliver them. So we don't even know the extent of the potential backsliding at this point. We don't know the extent of the economic impacts of of COVID-19 or the other crises, whether there have been floods, there has been locust infestations, there have been all kinds of things that that have been crises for different parts of the country. And so, without knowing the nature of how families have been affected, it's quite difficult to put in place mitigation strategies. So, for me, even sort of having, frequent, periodic, but slim surveys that are looking especially at food security and family diets, that's going to be really important. So just, in the COVID-19 data strategy group, we prioritized food security, the reach of safety nets, and the reach of health and nutrition programs as high priority areas for data gathering. And we could even, literally get dipstick data on what's happening with security, family diets, and the reach of some programs, say every few months, ideally, that would really support an agenda that helps and how to prevent backsliding and how to mitigate the effects, and for whom. What happens often is a lot of people doing the research will do it with the most marginalized population. But I think what one is hearing and seeing, not just from India, but from around the world, is that the number of and types of people who've been affected by the lockdown and the economic crises it's a very wide range. And so in a sense, while the most vulnerable are important, all 1,000-day families, across income groups are also very vulnerable. And so I think we need to understand more about what's going on there. I mean, more generally, I think, again, to me, I think all the work that people are doing on, continuing to understand the biology of child growth and, what kinds of things come together to support healthy growth, etc. That remains terribly important. But in terms of the delivery of solutions, any and all research that helps understand why, some interventions are only reaching or only being used by, say, 30% of the population, what is it that makes some interventions work in some places? That's terribly important research because that has relevance in the immediate. So those are I think 3 buckets of work that, should keep researchers around India and those interested in India busy for a long time. I hope that is helpful.
Purnima, that was amazing. Thank you so much for your time today. And I want to thank the audience for your really great questions and being engaged. And please, I'm sure, follow Purnima on Twitter. Please follow LIDC and you can look at our website and follow kind of what's happening on the Action Against Stunting Hub and recent work by IFPRI. Yeah, thanks so much for your time. And we will definitely be back in touch later in the year to hear more about what you're up to, Purnima. So thank you.
Great. Thank you for the opportunity. It was really nice to be here.
Okay.
And one of these days, I really look forward to hearing what the Stunting Hub is doing as well. But I will be in touch with our colleagues at NIM here about that also.
Absolutely. All right. Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you.